Earlier we discussed the first bucket of questions in ethics, and that is related to moral agency. Then we shifted to the second bucket, and that was on context. This time we will take a look at criteria, and we will take the first criterion for moral decision, which is responsibility. Moral responsibility relates to the issue of value. The decision is considered as responsible when it responds in freedom to value. Moral responsibility is the freedom or the capacity to respond to something of interest to the human person and to the human person's fulfillment or realization. The options available to freedom is a positive response, a negative response, or a temporizing, a hesitant response. The positive response we translated earlier as pagtugon sa pag-akit o hatak ng buti. Traditionally, in the history of ethics, the key issues about moral value are its status as an objective good, also called as intrinsic good or absolute good, a good without qualification, and a subjective good, a good that is only perceived to be as such, but is not actually such. The second question has to do with the typology of options. Faced with choices between the good or the better, is one free to choose or is one obligated to choose? Between a good and a bad choice, what is the human duty? And because of an imperfect world, there will be cases where we do not want to choose because the choices are both bad. And yet, we have to choose. And therefore, that is usually where the discussion of value, disvalue, misvalue occurs, together with what we earlier discussed as the voluntary. Today, the discussion has shifted to bonum, or the good, in its most abstract metaphysical sense, one that can be accepted in any culture, and therefore you're in search of a transcultural universal. Having determined what that is, you still have to deal with the concrete goods in context, the societal context, the economic context, the political context, the cultural context, and the religious context. In other words, universal value may have a single idea, but in context, it acquires many different phases. Accordingly, a third issue in the philosophy of ethics or values is how to align or arrange all of these goods in some kind of order, because evidently there will be conflict. There will be goods which are not clearly goods, and hence the issue of ambiguity, and whether they can be ordered in some kind of hierarchy so that one would have a criterion of choice in the event of conflict. From the viewpoint of the Filipino, what are the emics of our understanding of the ethics of value? In the past, we already had some philosophers wrestling with the idea of how to translate value. And the ordinary translation has been halaga. I have not been convinced about that. And in my own search, have settled on the term buti as the objective good. And pagpapahalaga as the process of determining or seeking the good. Those semantic disputes continue. At another level, I inquired whether from the social sciences we would have some kind of clue or indication of what we might consider as the core sociocultural values of the Filipinos. And there, after looking at the various studies and distilling them as best as I could, I arrived at 4 values that seem to represent consistent sociocultural values, possibly or reasonably abstract in the culture. And those are the values of love, power, honor, and security. On the other hand, it was evident at this particular point that these terms are anglicized terms, in fact, English concepts, which were rooted in the formulation of the question and responses to the question in a variety of Philippine languages. If we were to back translate several times across the different languages to Tagalog and go beyond that from the English and the Spanish equivalents, then what emerges are amor, poder, seguridad. And then the English equivalents. But looking, as I said, for the Tagalog primitives or the originals, I came to the conclusion that they represented katahimikan, kapangyarihan, kabutihang loob, kagandahang loob, at kalinisang loob. If you look at the diagram, you will see the various equivalents here. When you talk about security, that is the English term, but that does not translate directly into the Spanish seguridad. And we're all aware that siguro in the Philippines does not mean certainly, but maybe. That is how we have appropriated certain terms and given them nuances that no longer belong to the original. Kapangyarihan, on the other hand, is not simply power, poder, but kapangyarihan. And love split into 2 different values, and that is kabutihang loob and kagandahang loob. And honor was represented not by what you expect, an analytical term, but rather a description of loob as kalinisang loob. I reorganized this and took a look at how this might serve as guide to actual decision making. In other words, not only as the conclusion or a deduction from the data, but also as a functional tool in order to guide moral action. And there is all possibilities of teleological, deontological, pragmatic, character-wise arrangements, and so forth. In the ethical tradition, values were framed as the bonum, which served as the telos or objective or objectum actus, the good, as the intended object justifying the moral act. Modern sciences have enriched our understanding of value, by considering it from a diversity of perspectives. They've also resulted in a complexity that philosophical ethics must carefully navigate. In an earlier period when there were no social sciences, philosophy served for all. Today, because of the social sciences, there are many things we know that are philosophically incorrect, and therefore we have to pay attention to the social sciences before we philosophize. Hence, we need to review the value tradition in the social sciences. And there, we become aware of the multiplicity of perspectives. And when we sort them together, we can illustrate the differential character of what we collectively call social values in the following. You have the psychological values, the sociocultural values, philosophical values, and ethical values. My quest was for the core moral values of the Filipino. And here, I need to detail the processes and the findings for other persons and investigators or inquirers to determine whether they agree or disagree. So these are the Filipino core values which have been extracted, distilled, and decomposed, and further reconstrued as ethical value in the Filipino ethos. There, I used a philosophical screen with a 4-level template for ethical value, and I posed a caveat against conflating the socio-cultural with the ethical. So in the 4th place, I moved from Filipino ethics to Etikang Pinoy. I checked the differential imperatives that are present in pagpapakatao values. And finally, and take a look at the core values and the ethical configurations and moral decision-making with the teleological template as an illustration. This is the outline of this presentation then. Let us now take a closer look at value in the social sciences. As indicated, we said there are multiple perspectives when we check the social sciences on value. For example, axiology, the theory of value, is the study of the nature, the types, the criteria and judgments of value. Human activity tends after value. Why it does so, and how can be considered from a variety of perspectives. For example, the psychology of personality studies the psychoaffective and intellectual dynamics through which a person becomes aware of and realizes values. Cultural anthropology studies the genesis and evolution of values. And these values are studied as distinctive to different ethnic groups. Sociology, on the other hand, describes and interprets the values present within given groups and societies, and those are the ones that we are normally familiar with. Social psychology researches value formation and its influence on the reciprocal interactions of individuals and groups. Ethics, on the other hand, inquires into the source and ultimate meaning of values. Beyond that, religion focuses on values which relate to a supreme being or God. Pedagogy, on the other hand, has an interest in theories and methods related to value education. To illustrate the differential character of values, let me give 3 illustrations. Psychologically, value represents everything which the subject regards as an end, or as a means to reach an end, or to satisfy a physical, affective, and spiritual need. We find that, for example, in the desire, the valuing of the newborn, of the milk and maternal affection of the mother. The child has the following values: self-discovery in play, in imagination, and so on. In adolescence, the values are focused around sexuality and aggressivity. In adult life, the values are love for life, for the world, for equals, integrity, authentic self-giving in interpersonal relationships, and interest for work and hobbies. That is from psychology. Socioculturally, values constitute the totality of beliefs shared in a given group about the good, the desirable, and the achievable. For example, socio-moral values such as the concepts of country, independence, autonomy, and so on. Another example are the common models of behavior such as politeness, honor, tax honesty, and so forth. Yet another example are the elements which constitute the group as unique, such as cohesion, identity, and equality among unequal categories within the same society. Finally, you have another example of belonging, independence, solidarity, the right to life, the defense of life, justice, generosity, and so on. All of these are sociocultural values. Philosophically, on the other hand, value is any internal or external reality endowed with some positive quality. For example, it may be enjoyable, useful, just, true, beautiful, good, free, and so on. Formally, and you can express that somehow in a formula, value is the A of B, which is perceived as C, as positive D, and hence a value. The questions that arise are, when you look at A, value is the quality. Is value a fact, a quality, a relation, or something else? Recall our distinction between the objective versus the subjective basis of value. But A is the quality of B. Now, this B, of what is value a quality? Is it a quality of concrete objects, of concepts, of qualities, or of something else? And that is precisely the area of dispute on how to typologize or to hierarchize values. Yet another question is, how is A perceived? In what sense descriptively? And that is the concern precisely of philosophy through its methodologies of epistemology, phenomenology, and even heuristics. And finally, why? Or what are the reasons for considering the first quality in a positive sense? With the critical question, are such reasons valid? Are they reasonable? And are they such in a theoretical or also in a practical sense? So the question of philosophy is this: why indeed are values values? Theoretically, values are based on objective needs together with subjective appreciation. Human needs, not to be confused with human desires, can be classified in many ways according to different formalities. Substantively, for example, there are material or physical values for tao as animal or living being, such as biological value, health, or physical value of shelter. You have spiritual values, which are non-material, referring to tao as rational or transcending being, such as intellectual values, to know, or a religious value, meaning. There are personal and interpersonal values such as friendship, understanding, love, and acceptance for tao as a dialogical entity. And you also have communal, collective values for tao as social, in the sense of political and economic relations and their corresponding values. In the Filipino ethos, all substantive values are based on three principal values, namely, persons, ang sarili ko at ang aking kapwa, are the primordial or foundational values in Filipino thought. All other values have value only as values of and for persons. Secondly, within the ethical context, galaw or agency is a fundamental value of the person. It's an operational value because it is only through galaw that loob acquires greater clarity about itself, becomes truer to itself, and attains to greater unity as a whole. Third, ang ginagalawan is an integral condition to validate value because only within the existential setting can the good perceived in loob be authenticated as objective value in galaw. The authentication process inevitably occurs in any interaction with passive realities of labas. That is why we talk of reality checks. It is further authenticated in more complex ways with interactive realities such as kapwa, which are beyond our direct and immediate control. I said that we need to take a look at the Filipinos' core moral values. And my quest was guided by the following method, processes, and findings. First, I focused on the social sciences on sociocultural values as query. The second, the second stage was extraction, meaning the reconstitution of these values from the empirical studies. And there, what surfaced were the values of love, honor, power, and security, which we then subjected to multiple back translations. Next was the phase of distillation, extracting the idealized ethical core values, which resulted in the teleological value of katahimikan, the instrumental value of kapangyarihan, and the characteral values of kabutihang loob, kagandahang loob, at kalinisang loob. What needs to happen after that is to deconstruct, and that is to identify the core values' individual components. Set 1 refers to potentially ideal values for morality, spirituality, and theology, tending towards the abstract. Set 2 are the potentially concrete or applied values tending to the real and actual in anthropology, sociology, politics, economics, and the like. Contextualization refers to the validation of its values' functionality. The second-level values, both subjective and objective, are capable of further specification into third-level values as embedded in defined contexts of moral action, such as social relations, economic engagement, political participation, cultural creation, and so on. Such third values are often the more recognizable, familiar, and popular values which have been lexicalized differently by the various vernaculars. If you look then at the Pinoy core values as extracted, distilled, and decomposed, you find, in terms of the Anglo and Hispanic renditions of security, as seguridad. On the personal level, it refers to a loob or subjective dimension. On the objective side, you refer to labas. And therefore, what you have specifying security are a sense of ligtas and ayos. The Filipino core values then would be kaligtasan and kaayusan, defining katahimikan. That is the formal Filipino translation or rendition of seguridad and security. We said that love translated to amor, but when back translated to Filipino, persistently divided into two kinds of values. And on the personal virtue side, you have kagandahang loob. And on the objective value side, kabutihang loob, which lead to the conclusion or the deduction of love being defined by bait and buti. The Filipino value of honor, which surfaced from the sociocultural studies, goes back to the Spanish honor, but translates back to the Filipino kalinisang loob, which are composed of two other values, katapatan at dangal. And finally, you have poder, which is the Spanish version of power, but which in the Filipino understanding really translates to kapangyarihan, which again, looked at from the viewpoint of the subjective and the objective dimensions, result in kakayahan at lakas. Only with kakayahan can you have kapangyarihan, and only through lakas does kapangyarihan come to be. We look at these sociocultural values and we construe them as ethical values in the ethos. And for that, I used a philosophical screen and a template of questions. At the level of mores, the question could be something like, who is the good mom, dad, son, daughter, and so on. At the level of ethos, you pose the question, how is this person good? Graduating to the ethics level is no longer a question of how, but why. And at the meta-ethics level, the question becomes, what purpose? For what is this person good? So at the level of mores, you have the result of the role value norms or the phenomena. On the ethos side, you have the role-free value norms. And there you find the motivations. On the ethics side, you have the philosophical, the cultural aspirations, translated as the grounds for the value. And finally, on the meta-ethical side, you have the ideals or the foundation of all values. An example of that, when you look at the mores side, you have the psychology of hiya, utang na loob, pakikisama, etc., and all the other values that have been taught to us in school. On the ethos side, you have the social anthropological theories of SIR, smooth interpersonal relationships, the philosophy of kapwa, and my own proposal of buti and bait to try to understand the norms at the mores level. At the ethics level, you have the philosophy or the philosophical analysis of love, power, honor, and security in English, Spanish, and Filipino. And on the meta-ethics side, you bring all of this under a religious or theological perspective of Tao per se and in relation to God. That is the philosophical screen. On the practical side, there is the caveat of conflating socio-cultural value norms with ethical values and moral norms. Philosophical ethics requires that we clearly differentiate the emic socio-cultural norms distinctive of the culture from the ethic or the transcultural values shared with other cultures. A comparison of values and norms helps us see this contrast with traditional presentations of freedom in the formally abstract sense, sometimes called by philosophers as transcendental freedom, which is divorced from the culture or where we exercise categorical freedom. As acknowledged by both secular and religious thinkers, a distinction must be made between the letter of the law, its norms, and the spirit of the law, its values. We can look at several examples where cultural values are conflated with moral norms. In the academe, how often do you hear this? Ipasa mo na, mabait naman. Or, when somebody is apprehended in traffic, sorry bossing, hindi ko nakilala ang sasakyan. Or, please facilitate the papers of sister. And you could cite other examples where value is conflated with the norm, and very often in an improper way. The same problem occurs at a more serious level when we have to discern the responsible action, and there you see how the ethos struggles with itself on how to respond to the ethical questions. In denouncing incest, what value or norm dominates? Shame for the victim or shame for the rapist? Sino ba ang dapat mahiya? Sino ang lumapas tangan sa dangal? Sino ang dapat usigin? Sino ang dapat hiyain? Culturally, ang nahihiya ay yung hindi dapat mahiya. At yung dapat mahiya, yun ang nakakawala. The ethos conflicts with the ethics because the ethics has not been rationalized enough in order to critique the ethos. In prostitution or the drug trade, should you arrest the prostitute or the pimp? Should you arrest the victim or the pusher? We look at the socio-cultural value. A simple diagram can help to see the difference. The first frame, or the first and the second column, you see A1, the ethical value, which in A2 translates into the moral norm. At the second row, you have the personal psychological value, which translates into the personal norm or principle. Just as a matter of distinction, because these are not automatic. This is simply an analysis. At the lowest column, at the lowest row, you see C1, which is the sociological value and the sociological norm. True values and norms are those which are totally convergent and also totally accepted, where A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2 are joined as a whole. Partial values and norms are those which are not fully coherent in their elements or are selectively accepted. For example, you accept A1, you accept the value, but not the norm. Or you accept the sociological value, but do not accept it as the personal value, and so forth. And of course, there are pseudo values, which are those which are uncritically present as value as norm and norm as value. In order to simplify this, you take a look at the essential patterns and you find differential imperatives of pagpapakatao values, allowing us to see the transition from the Filipino ethos to the Filipino ethics. Diwa, for example, would constitute or refer to the Malay-isip dynamics, resulting in the analysis and separation of fact from truth. Puso, on the other hand, constituted by Dama and Bait, will not only focus on what one feels, but on what is appropriate. And loob is not only dictated to by genotypal will, or decided by kalooban according to need and imperative. The three can be seen as one set related to pagpapakatao, except that it is diwa which sorts out the issues of pagpapakatao analytically. But it is in puso that we accept and we perceive yung pinagpapakatauhan natin. Saan tayo nagiging tao? And only in the decisional level do you see the values na pagpapakatauhan mo, na itataya mo ang lahat. So ethical values are those goods which humanize the human being. And principles are those rules for behaving which safeguard and defend or promote and enhance human activity as truly human and humanizing. In synthesis, we can take a look at the core values, their ethical configurations, and see whether they can guide to moral decision-making. And of the varieties that are available, I've chosen to represent here only the teleological as a template. If you look at the first column, you have the Anglo and the Hispanic. The second column, the personal or the law of dimensions. The middle column refers to the various values as discerned from the social studies. And then on the objective side, referred to reality checks in labas. You have the corresponding values once more. And on the final column, you have a characterization taken precisely from the ethical literature and tradition. So katahimikan is the end or final value. That is why it is called teleological. Katahimikan are the values that we pursue in different areas, but at core katahimikan, which can split into values of kaligtasan and kaayusan, and further downward with regard to the different domains. Insofar as love is concerned, love or non-love, these are the personal values, and that's the terminology that's used in the social sciences. But in the philosophical ethics, they may be called personal values or alternatively personal virtues. When we think about the right or husto, that is the value of kabutihang loob, which can be decomposed into the values of matwid at tama. On the other hand, honor is the value that we translate into kalinisang loob, which are constituted by the values of katapatan at karangalan. And finally, you have the value of kapangyarihan, which translates into the Spanish poder, but which is constituted into kaya and lakas, and which is the instrumental value, or in ethics, the functional value. An analysis of value is complex and its application difficult, but it is not impossible because as a people we recognize, and as the saying goes, ang mabigat ay gumagaan kung pinagtutulungan. Maraming salamat sa inyong pakikinig.